After decades of silence, best-selling author and televangelist Joyce Meyer has dropped a revelation no one saw coming, and it's not about faith, finances, or forgiveness. At 82, in a moment that stunned even her closest followers, Meyer finally confessed the one truth she kept hidden through countless sermons and life lessons. There was a man who quietly held her heart all along. And he wasn't just a fleeting chapter. He was the love of her life. It's the kind of confession that stops you mid-scroll and makes you ask, wait, did she really just say that? At 82 years old, Joyce Meyer, the powerhouse preacher whose voice has filled arenas, television screens, and best-selling bookshelves for decades, just delivered the most unexpected sermon of her life, and this time, it wasn't about scripture. With millions watching and decades of public ministry behind her, Meyer leaned in with a candor rarely seen in the polished world of televangelism and said it plainly. He was the love of my life. No prelude, no build-up, just a seismic shift in tone that sent shockwaves through her loyal base and longtime critics alike. For someone who's built a global brand around discipline, healing, and spiritual resilience, this admission was more than surprising. It was intimate, human, and vulnerable in a way that felt almost too raw for someone so famously composed. Instantly, speculation ignited. Who was he? A husband? A fleeting flame from the past? Someone from her ministry circle? Or could it be someone we never saw coming, someone hidden in plain sight, tucked between sermons and stages for all these years? In a media landscape obsessed with youth, drama, and scandal, it's rare for an 82-year-old to steal the spotlight with something real. But that's exactly what Joyce Meyer has done. This wasn't a headline crafted by a publicist. This was a moment of truth delivered by a woman who spent her life teaching others how to move on from pain, but who may have quietly carried a love story she never fully got to live. And now, after all this time, she's ready to talk about it. To understand the weight of Joyce Meyer's confession, you have to rewind the tape. Way back, long before the packed stadiums, the multi-million-dollar ministry, or the empire of books and broadcasts. Before the name Joyce Meyer was synonymous with faith and fierce independence, she was just a girl named Pauline Joyce Hutchison, growing up in the shadow of trauma. Her early years were marked by unspeakable abuse at the hands of her father, a fact she would later bravely disclose in her teachings, turning her pain into a cornerstone of her message. You can heal, you can overcome, and your past doesn't define your future. That raw, unapologetic honesty became her trademark. By the 1990s, Meyer was rising through the evangelical ranks not just as a female preacher, still a rarity, but as a survivor, a straight shooter, and a spiritual force who could balance tough love with deep compassion. Her broadcasts, Enjoying Everyday Life, became a global mainstay, offering guidance on everything from forgiveness to finance. And through it all, she projected a powerful image, steadfast, focused, grounded. A woman who had weathered every storm and come out stronger, wiser, and fiercely in control of her destiny. But if you watched closely over the years, you might have noticed what wasn't there. Unlike many of her contemporaries in ministry, Meyer rarely invited the world into her personal love story. Yes, she spoke of her marriage to Dave Meyer, often with gratitude and humor, but the details were always selective, almost sanitized. There were no sprawling romantic anecdotes, no publicized Valentine's Day moments, no teary-eyed love declarations on stage. Just the facts, the respect, and the occasional laugh. For a woman so emotionally open in her teachings, her romantic history was a quiet corner she rarely explored in full view. Which is why her recent confession feels so seismic. Because it suggests that the real story, the deepest story, wasn't part of the public narrative. It wasn't in the books or the sermons or the stadium speeches. It was tucked away, perhaps out of fear, or duty, or heartbreak. Maybe it was a chapter too painful to relive, or too sacred to expose. Whatever the reason, Joyce Meyer had built a legacy on transparency, yet somehow managed to keep this particular truth buried beneath decades of spotlight. Now, with the lens of hindsight and the clarity of age, she's choosing to share what she once kept hidden. And it forces us to reconsider everything we thought we knew, not just about her love life, but about the woman behind the ministry. Because this isn't just a story about romance. It's a story about timing, identity, and the complexity of carrying an untold love while the world watches you preach healing. It wasn't the stage lights or the sermons, not a primetime special or a planned media rollout. It happened in a quiet, almost offhand moment. Joyce Meyer, now 82, sat across from a longtime interviewer she'd known for decades. The conversation had drifted to legacy, to regrets, to the hidden corners of life that even the most public figures keep tucked away. And then she said it, simply, calmly, but with a weight that stopped the room cold. He was the love of my life. Those 7 words fell like a thunderclap, not because they were shouted or emphasized, but because of what they seemed to carry: history, heartbreak, memory, and maybe even longing. There was no flash of drama in her eyes. No tears, no trembling hands. Just stillness. As if she had waited years to give this sentence a place in the world, and now that it was out, she didn't need to explain. But the world needed her to. Speculation spread instantly.
Who was she talking about?
Her husband Dave, the man who has stood beside her through ministry highs and personal lows for over 5 decades? That would make sense on paper. But it was her use of past tense that sent a ripple through the audience. Was the love of my life. Not is. Not always has been. That small grammatical shift set the internet ablaze. Was it a former flame from before her ministry days? Someone from the period of her life she's openly described as painful and fragmented, before her conversion, before her empire, before she became Joyce Meyer? A name she's never shared publicly? That theory gained traction quickly, especially as fans noted the almost wistful quality in her voice. It wasn't about confession for drama's sake. It was about naming something sacred, something buried, something she had never had permission to say until now. For those who followed her story, this isn't just gossip. It's a revelation that deepens the mystery of a woman who's built an entire platform around transparency, faith, and healing. Joyce Meyer has never claimed to be perfect. She's spoken, candidly and bravely, about surviving childhood abuse, a broken early adulthood, and the lifelong work of becoming whole. But love, romantic love, has always been framed in the context of her marriage to Dave. Reliable, steadfast, enduring. This confession didn't contradict that exactly, but it complicated it. Her audience, many of whom have aged right alongside her, felt the layers in that moment. Because anyone over 50 knows, the past doesn't always stay in the past. First loves, unspoken losses, what ifs, they linger, sometimes unresolved, sometimes ungrieved. And when you reach a certain age, the urge to speak plainly, to make peace with everything left unsaid, becomes louder than the need to maintain a clean, public narrative. Joyce's admission didn't come with a name. No identifying detail, just the truth as she carried it. That somewhere in the mosaic of her life, someone held that sacred place in her heart. And for the first time, she allowed us to see that space. As the confession echoed, he was the love of my life. The next question hung heavily in the air. What about Dave? For over 50 years, Dave Meyer has stood beside Joyce as her husband, ministry partner, protector, and quiet force behind her global empire. Their relationship was never about flashy displays or showy affection. It was about endurance, devotion, faith that held fast through storm after storm. And yet, with a single sentence, Joyce cast a long, unspoken shadow over the marriage millions had looked to as a model of strength. To the outside world, Dave has always been content to play the background. In Joyce's words, he was the one who loved her when she was hardest to love. The man who believed in her when she was still breaking. He raised her children. He helped build her ministry. He walked her path, not just beside her, but often behind her, letting her take the spotlight. And now, years later, it's fair to ask, what does he feel, hearing her speak of another man as the love of her life? Publicly, there has been no response from Dave. No statement, no interview, not even a social media post to hint at his state of mind. But silence has a language of its own, and longtime followers of the Meyers have noticed the tension. In recent appearances, Dave has looked more reserved, more distant. Some even noted that during their last joint event, the warm smile seemed slightly dimmed, the physical closeness just a little less natural. It could be nothing, or it could be everything. The confession has created a divide, not just in public opinion, but among Joyce's most loyal supporters. Some defend her fiercely, pointing out that love and gratitude don't always exist in the same emotional category, that you can love someone deeply and still have another soul who once lit a match in your heart that never truly went out. Others, however, see it differently. They feel the sting of betrayal on Dave's behalf. How could she say that after all he's done for her? Wrote one longtime follower in the comments of a now viral Facebook post. After 50 years, he deserved better. But perhaps the real heartbreak isn't in the words themselves, but in what they reveal about the complex nature of love. Because here's the truth that most public figures aren't allowed to say out loud. Long marriages are often built on decisions, not just desire. On choosing each other every day, not always feeling the same rush of passion, but showing up when it matters most. And in that context, Joyce's confession doesn't necessarily diminish her love for Dave. It reframes it. It acknowledges that there are kinds of love that change you, and kinds that save you. Sometimes they're the same person. Sometimes they're not. What makes this fallout even more compelling is the timing. Joyce has spent a lifetime preaching the power of emotional honesty, healing, and grace. But now, she's the one under the microscope. The roles have flipped. Her confession forces her audience to grapple with the same emotional contradictions they once looked to her to resolve. Can someone be grateful to their spouse and still carry love for someone else? Can a heart be faithful and still haunted? There's also the question of what she's protecting. The lack of a name, the refusal to elaborate, feels deliberate, as though she's drawing a boundary between confession and scandal, between truth and damage. She let the door creak open, but she hasn't walked through it. That choice alone speaks volumes. It's not about shaming the past or rewriting her present. It's about acknowledging that our hearts don't always obey the lives we build around them. For many fans, the emotional fallout feels oddly familiar, because we all live with unfinished stories, with people we've loved that we couldn't stay with choices we've made out of faith, duty, or simply timing. And when someone like Joyce Meyer, who has spent decades living as a symbol of stability, suddenly steps into the messy, beautiful, painful terrain of unfinished love, it doesn't just surprise us. It humanizes her. The ripple effect of her confession isn't just tabloid fodder. It's a mirror, a reminder that no matter how faithful, famous, or well put together we appear on the outside, love, real love, isn't always clean. And sometimes, the greatest act of courage is telling the truth about it anyway. That's the question everyone's asking. Why now? Why? After decades of carefully curating her message, maintaining a rock-solid image, and protecting the sanctity of her marriage and ministry, would Joyce Meyer choose this moment, at 82, to reveal a buried truth that changes everything? Why wait until now to say, "He was the love of my life"? It's tempting to chalk it up to age. There's something about crossing into your 80s that shifts the ground beneath you. You become aware, sometimes quietly, sometimes with a jolt, that the road ahead is shorter than the one behind. For a woman like Joyce, who has spent nearly every moment of her adult life pouring out wisdom, teaching millions how to heal, how to forgive, how to let go of shame, it might be that she finally realized there was one last message she hadn't delivered. One last wound she hadn't dressed with her usual bold honesty. One secret she'd kept even from herself. This wasn't a calculated media stunt. It didn't come with a book rollout, a podcast launch, or a new tour announcement. If anything, it landed during a rare season of retreat. In recent months, fans have noticed Joyce stepping back from some of her regular commitments, pausing certain broadcasts, quietly canceling appearances, handing more airtime to guest speakers on her platform. It's been subtle, but not unnoticed. The confession seems to fit into a larger, more personal shift, a turning inward that's become almost a rite of passage for public figures of a certain age. And perhaps, in that stillness, the past became louder. Memories she'd compartmentalized. Feelings she'd rationalized. Names she'd erased. They came knocking. Because here's the truth no one wants to say out loud. Even the strongest faith can't make you forget. Even the happiest marriage can't erase the echo of someone who once knew your soul before you were fully formed. There's also the possibility, one that feels tender and hard to touch, that this confession wasn't just about honesty. It was about legacy. Joyce Meyer has always been a legacy builder. A woman who turned personal trauma into global ministry, who authored dozens of books, preached to packed arenas, and built a spiritual brand synonymous with strength. But what happens when a legacy feels incomplete? When a piece of your story was never allowed to be spoken, not because it wasn't true, but because it didn't fit the narrative people expected from you. By speaking now, Joyce may not be trying to rewrite her story, but rather to complete it. Not for headlines, not for ratings, for herself. There's something poignant and powerfully human about that. In a world obsessed with image, especially within religious and inspirational circles, admitting to a complex emotional truth this late in life isn't a scandal. It's a reclamation. It's the kind of unfiltered clarity that only comes after you've seen how quickly time moves, how fragile relationships can be, and how rare it is to truly love someone with every part of your being, whether or not the world ever knew their name. Some speculate that Joyce's confession is connected to grief, that perhaps this unnamed love of her life, is gone.
Passed on.
And in his absence, the silence no longer felt holy, it felt hollow. That the moment of truth had arrived not with fanfare, but with absence. And when that grief finally caught up to her, it demanded voice. Not to reopen wounds, but to close them, gently, with the dignity of acknowledgement. Others believe this is Joyce's way of modeling vulnerability in its most raw form. That in a culture increasingly allergic to nuance, where people are sorted into saints or sinners, perfect spouses or homewreckers, faithful or unfaithful, this was her way of saying, we are all more complicated than the roles we play. And if even she, a woman who built her career on spiritual transparency, can carry an unspoken truth for decades, then maybe there's hope for the rest of us. Hope that our contradictions can coexist. That our stories can be messy and sacred at the same time. And then there's one final possibility, the one few are brave enough to say. Maybe Joyce Meyer didn't say it for us at all. Maybe she said it for him, wherever he is, whoever he was. Maybe the words weren't meant to spark headlines, but to travel through time and space and land wherever that love now rests. Maybe he needed to hear it, or maybe she did. As the dust settled and Joyce Meyer's quiet confession continued to ripple through media, it became clear that the moment was bigger than a headline. It wasn't just a twist in the life story of a beloved spiritual figure. It was a moment that pierced through the screen and landed right where it hurts, in the hearts of her audience. Because, whether they admitted it aloud or not, many people watching didn't just hear Joyce's words, they felt them.
Deeply. Personally.
Like she had reached across the divide and whispered a truth they hadn't dared to speak for themselves. Because who among us doesn't have a love that lingers? Not every viewer grew up in church pews or followed Joyce's decades of teachings, but everyone knows what it means to carry a memory that never fully left. A person we walked away from, or who walked away from us. Not because the love was too small, but because life was too big. Timing, family, responsibility, fear, faith. It all plays a part. And sometimes we silence that story so well, we forget it's still living quietly in us. Until someone else says it out loud. In that one sentence, he was the love of my life. Joyce unintentionally unlocked a memory vault for millions. Social media lit up not just with speculation, but with stories. Real ones. Heartbreaking ones. Anonymous posts flooded the comments beneath her videos and articles. I married a good man, but the one who truly had my heart? I left him at 23 when my father told me he'd never approve. She said what I've never been able to admit. I still dream about him, 40 years later. This made me cry harder than I expected. I thought I'd made peace. Maybe I haven't. In that way, Joyce did more than confess. She connected. Not as a preacher or a personality, but as a woman. A woman with layers, regrets, memories, and emotions too complex to tie up with a sermon. And in doing so, she gave her audience permission to feel, without immediately fixing it. She offered no moral conclusion, no tidy life lesson, just truth. And that, ironically, might be the most spiritual moment of all. Because faith communities often struggle with nuance. We're taught to move on, to let go and let God, to tuck the messy stuff into the corners and focus on what's still working. But Joyce didn't move on, she reached back. She pulled something from her past, not to idolize it, not to shame herself, but simply to say, this mattered. This shaped me. This love existed. And if someone like Joyce Meyer can say that, without fear of judgment, without rewriting her marriage, without diminishing her ministry, then maybe so can the rest of us. For older viewers, especially women who've spent their lives giving to others, building families, keeping marriages together, choosing stability over desire, this moment hit like a revelation. Because they saw themselves in her steadiness, in her silence, and now in her honesty. They've also made choices that came at the cost of wild love. They too have people whose names they haven't spoken in decades, but who remain etched into memory like it was yesterday. Younger viewers, on the other hand, saw something else, a warning and a gift. A message not to wait until it's too late to say what matters. To risk speaking the words before time decides for you. To ask themselves, if I reach 82, what truth will I still be holding back? And who will I wish I had told it to? This is the rare kind of story that doesn't end with the person it's about. It becomes everyone's story. Not because Joyce is famous, but because she's real. In that one sentence, she collapsed the boundary between the stage and the seat, between her platform and our personal lives. She reminded her audience that love doesn't always fit in the box we want it to, that the human heart is too wild, too sacred, too stubborn to follow neat timelines or cultural expectations. And that's why people are still talking. Not because they're shocked, but because they understand. Because deep down, most of us are carrying a name we never got to say out loud. In the end, Joyce Meyer's quiet confession wasn't just a moment. It became a mirror. For her fans, for her critics, and for anyone who's ever loved deeply and imperfectly, it was a reminder that the human story is never as clean as we want it to be. That even a woman who has preached to millions, authored countless books on forgiveness and freedom, and built a life defined by purpose and discipline, still had one truth she hadn't let out into the light until now. He was the love of my life. 7 words, a lifetime inside them. And now, a million interpretations beyond them. The impact wasn't just felt in the headlines or on social media or even in her fan base. It went deeper. It reached into families, marriages, friendships. It started uncomfortable conversations at dinner tables. It stirred buried emotions in people who hadn't thought about that person in decades. And it made even the most secure relationships glance sideways and ask quietly, is there someone you still think about? But more than anything, it humanized Joyce in a way her preaching never quite could. It stripped away the ministry, the lights, the rehearsed wisdom, and left us with a woman, an aging woman, a woman who had lived an extraordinary life, yes, but one still punctuated by unanswered questions, unrealized possibilities, and private loves that never made it into her public sermons. And that's where the real takeaway lies. Not in whether she should or shouldn't have said it. Not in whether Dave feels hurt. Not in speculation around who he was. But in what this confession teaches us about ourselves. Because we all carry unfinished chapters. We all have loves we chose not to keep or weren't allowed to. We all have what-ifs and almosts and names that live somewhere inside us, whether we want them to or not. Joyce's vulnerability cracks the illusion that those feelings disappear with time or that wisdom erases longing. It shows us that love isn't something we outgrow, it's something that transforms. And that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is finally name it. For those who followed her for years, this moment will live on not as a betrayal, but as a gift. A final lesson, not wrapped in doctrine or scripture, but in raw truth. A message that says, even if your choices were right, even if your life turned out exactly as it should have, there may still be space in your soul where another name quietly resides. And that's not failure. That's being human. Joyce Meyer spent her life telling others how to find peace. Maybe this confession was her way of finally finding a piece of her own. And for all of us watching, wondering, remembering, maybe it's not too late to do the same.